From captivity to marriage, ours is a love story. The stars outside the reinforced viewport were cold and distant, like everything else aboard the Vrethkai prison station, known as Void Keep. Commander Lyra Voss sat on the hard metal floor of her cell, back straight, eyes sharp. Her dark uniform was torn at the shoulder. There was a dried cut above her left eyebrow. Her hands were steady. She had been captured 3 days ago. 3 days was enough time for most prisoners to break, to cry, to beg, to lose the light in their eyes. The Vrethkai had seen it happen hundreds of times before. It was expected. It was, in their experience, inevitable. Lyra had not cried. She had not begged. And the light in her eyes had not faded even slightly. If anything, it had grown sharper. She was using the time to study. Every guard rotation, every sound in the corridor, every vibration in the floor that told her something about the station's engine placement. She counted steps. She memorized faces. She listened to the strange, low, clicking language of the Vrethkai guards and began identifying patterns, not enough to understand words yet, but enough to read tone. Lyra Voss was not surviving captivity. She was working inside it. Down the corridor, in a block of 6 connected cells, the other captured humans were doing what humans always do when placed in impossible situations. They were adapting. Sergeant Davin Cole, a broad-shouldered engineer with a calm face and fast hands, had already identified a loose panel beneath his cot. He had not touched it yet. He was waiting for the right moment. He was also waiting for orders, because in 17 years of military service, one truth had never failed him. When Lyra Voss was in the building, you waited for Lyra Voss. Medic Priya Anand had torn a strip of fabric from her inner lining and fashioned a basic wound dressing for the soldier in the next cell who had taken a blow to the ribs during capture. She had done this quietly, calmly, and with a steady hand, as if she were working in a proper medical bay rather than a prison block aboard an alien space station somewhere beyond the reach of any human map. The youngest of the group, a 23-year-old communications officer named Eli Marsh, sat curled in the corner of his cell. He looked frightened, and he was, but he was also doing something careful and deliberate with the small communication chip he had swallowed just before capture. He had retrieved it. He was not going to say how. It was cracked, but not dead. He was working on it with a piece of wire he had pulled from his boot lining. These were humans. This is what they did. The Vrethkai guards found them deeply unsettling. The Vrethkai were an old and powerful species. Tall, gray-skinned, with large, pale eyes built for low-light environments, and voices like gravel shifting underground. They had conquered 17 systems. They had broken species far more physically imposing than these small, soft, warm-blooded creatures from a medium-sized planet called Earth. But those other species had behaved like prisoners. These humans behaved like they were conducting a military operation from inside a cage. The guards reported this, with visible discomfort, to the station warden. The warden reported it, with equal discomfort, to High Commander Athos. Athos received the report in his private office at the far end of the station. He read it twice, then he set it down, and looked out at the stars for a long moment. He was not a being who was easily surprised. He had served the Vrethkai Empire for 20 years, had overseen the containment of dozens of alien species, and had built his reputation on one simple principle: understand what you are dealing with before it becomes a problem. He had not understood what he was dealing with, and it had already become a problem. He picked up the report again and focused on one name that appeared 3 times in 3 separate guard observations. Commander Lyra Voss, human female, senior officer, shows no signs of psychological deterioration, appears to be coordinating prisoner behavior through nonverbal signals, advise immediate isolation. Athos tapped the edge of the report against his desk slowly. Isolation was the standard response. It was logical. It was efficient. But something about the description made him pause. No signs of psychological deterioration. 3 days in Void Keep, and not a single sign. He wanted to see that for himself. When Athos entered Lyra's cell, she was standing, not because she had heard him coming, though she had, but because she had decided, on her very first day, that she would always be standing when they came. It was a small thing, but small things were how humans drew lines. He was taller than she expected. His pale eyes moved over her quickly, assessing, calculating. She recognized the look. She had worn it herself many times. She met his gaze without blinking. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Athos said, in careful translated human language loaded into his communication device, "You are the one giving them instructions." It was not a question. Lyra tilted her head slightly. "You made a mistake taking us," she said. The silence that followed was long. Athos looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in a very long time, he was not entirely sure what he was looking at. He turned and left without another word. But he did not send the isolation order. The next morning, Athos came back. He told himself it was routine. He told himself it was professional duty, a senior officer personally assessing a high-value prisoner. He told himself many logical and reasonable things as he walked down the corridor toward Lyra's cell. None of those things were entirely true. The honest reason was simpler. He had not been able to stop thinking about what she had said. "You made a mistake taking us." "Not me, not I," she had said us. Even in a prison cell, completely alone, she had spoken as a unit, as a collective. She had not separated herself from her people even by a single word. That kind of thinking, that instinct, was not something Athos had encountered before. Among the Vrethkai, rank separated, authority divided. A senior officer in captivity would distance themselves from lower ranks to preserve personal status. This human had done the exact opposite. It stayed with him all night, and so, in the morning, he came back. Lyra was sitting cross-legged on the floor when he arrived, eyes closed. She opened them the moment the door slid open, not startled, just aware, like she had been waiting. Athos stepped inside and stood near the door. He had his communication device with him, loaded with translated human language. He looked at her for a moment, then said, "I have questions." "So do I," Lyra replied evenly. He was not expecting that. "You are the prisoner. That doesn't stop me from being curious," she said. "Sit down if you want. The floor is hard, but it's honest." But he also did not leave. And that was how the first real conversation between a Vrethkai High Commander and a human prisoner began. Standing on opposite sides of a small cell, both of them pretending it was something other than what it was. Athos asked about human military structure. Lyra answered in ways that revealed nothing useful, but explained everything interesting. She described how human units were built on trust rather than fear, on shared purpose rather than strict hierarchy alone. She told him that a human soldier would follow a good leader into impossible situations, not because they were ordered to, but because they chose to. "Choice is inefficient," Athos said. "Choice is powerful," Lyra replied. "There is a difference." He asked about Earth. She told him. She described a planet that had been burning itself down and rebuilding itself back up for thousands of years. Wars, diseases, natural disasters that wiped out entire populations. Moments where humanity stood at the very edge of its own extinction, and still found a way to wake up the next morning and keep going. Athos listened to all of it without expression, but his pale eyes were very focused. "Why did you keep going?" he asked. "When the destruction was so great, when survival was so unlikely, why not simply accept the end?" Lyra looked at him for a long moment. Then she said something quiet and simple that he would think about for a very long time afterward. Because there was always someone who wasn't ready to give up, and that one person was always enough to pull the rest forward. The room was very still after that. Athos returned the following day, and the day after that. The sessions were officially logged as interrogations. The reports Athos filed were clean and professional. Prisoner assessment, behavioral analysis, intelligence evaluation. Nothing in those reports revealed that the interrogations had slowly, without either party planning it, become something closer to conversations between two people who were genuinely interested in understanding each other. Lyra was careful. She never gave tactical information. She never revealed anything about human fleet positions or military capabilities, but she talked freely about humanity itself, its history, its failures, its stubborn and sometimes ridiculous refusal to accept defeat. And Aethos, who had spent his entire career studying species in order to contain them, found himself doing something he had never done before. He was not studying her to contain her. He was listening because he wanted to know. Meanwhile, the other humans were not idle. Sergeant Davin Cole had finally made careful, quiet contact with the loose panel beneath his cot. Behind it was a secondary wiring channel. Not a security system, just environmental controls. Useless for escape, but potentially useful for other things. He reported this to Lyra through their silent, careful signal system during meal distribution. Lyra processed the information and made a decision. Not yet. They would not act yet. The timing had to be right. More importantly, she had begun to sense something in Aethos that she wanted to understand better before making any move. He was not like what she had expected. He was not cruel. He was not enjoying their captivity, the way some of the guards clearly did. He was, and she chose this word carefully in her own mind, conflicted. And conflicted people were either the most dangerous thing in a room or the most important. She had not yet decided which one he was. On the 5th day, at the end of their session, Aethos stood to leave and then stopped at the door. He did not turn around. He just stood there for a moment, his back to her. "Your people," he said quietly. "They follow you because they trust you. No one has ever trusted me," he said. "They have respected me, feared me, obeyed me. But trust is..." He paused. "That is a different thing entirely." He left before she could respond. Lyra sat in the silence he left behind and felt something shift. Very small, very quiet, somewhere in the center of her chest. She did not have a name for it yet, but it was there. It started with a sound. A deep, low vibration that moved through the floor of the prison block like a slow warning. Most people would not have noticed it. Most people would have felt it in their feet and assumed it was normal. Just the station settling, just the engines adjusting, just background noise in the belly of a massive space structure. Lyra noticed it immediately. She pressed her palm flat against the floor and felt it again. Uneven. Irregular. That was not an engine rhythm. That was something struggling. She stood up and moved to the small vent near the top of her cell wall and listened. Beneath the normal sounds of the station, the distant footsteps, the hum of life support, the occasional click of Rethkai conversation, she could hear something new, a strained, high-pitched cycling sound that kept cutting out and restarting. She had worked near enough reactor systems in her military career to recognize that sound. That was a cooling cycle failing. 12 minutes later, every alarm on Void Keep went off at once. Red light flooded the corridors. The guards moved fast, shouting in their clicking language, running toward the engineering section at the far end of the station. The prison block was suddenly half empty of personnel. Everyone with technical knowledge had been pulled toward the crisis. In the chaos, Lyra stood at the front of her cell door and waited. Down the corridor, she could hear Davin Cole's calm voice quietly counting seconds between alarm pulses. He was doing exactly what she would have told him to do. Measuring, calculating, staying ready. Then, the footsteps she had been expecting came fast down the corridor. Aethos appeared at her cell door. His expression was controlled, but his eyes were moving quickly. The eyes of someone doing rapid calculations and not liking the results. "Reactor cooling system," he said without introduction. "Primary and secondary both failing. Our engineers cannot stabilize the feedback loop. We have..." He stopped. "Approximately 40 minutes before this station becomes a problem that cannot be solved. You need us." It was not a question. She already knew the answer. He would not be standing at her cell door otherwise. Aethos held her gaze for one long moment. Then he pressed the release on her cell door. "Yes," he said simply. I need you. Lyra moved immediately. She did not celebrate the open door. She did not make a remark. She stepped out, looked down the corridor, and said clearly, open all of them. Now. Every person I have is an asset, and I need all of them. Aethos opened every cell without hesitation. Devon Cole came out rolling his shoulders, already focused. Priya Anand was 2 steps behind him, calm as still water. Eli Marsh came out last, clutching his cracked communication chip in one hand out of habit, eyes wide but steady. Lyra looked at her team. Reactor cooling failure. 40 minutes. Davin, you're on the primary system. Priya, I need you with the station crew. Anyone injured during the initial surge, you handle them. Eli, find a working terminal and get me a full schematic of the station's engineering layout in the next 5 minutes. They moved without a single wasted second. Aethos watched this happen and said nothing. But something in his expression changed. Very slightly, almost invisibly, like a wall developing its first crack. The next 30 minutes were the most intense of Lyra's captivity, and possibly her career. The reactor room was loud, hot, and full of panicked Vrethkai engineers who did not know whether to trust the humans running alongside them or block their path. Aethos walked ahead of Lyra and cleared every hesitation with a single sharp command. His authority on this station was absolute, and he used every piece of it without reservation. Lyra and Davin reached the primary cooling console together. The problem was immediately visible. A feedback loop had created a pressure buildup that the automatic systems kept trying to release in the wrong direction, making it worse with every cycle. They've been fighting it instead of redirecting it, Davin said, already moving his hands across the console. Can you fix it? I can do better than fix it, he said. Give me 18 minutes. Lyra turned and spent those 18 minutes coordinating everything else, managing communication between her team and the Vrethkai engineers, translating technical decisions through Aethos when the language barrier became a wall, keeping the energy in the room focused and calm when it wanted to become panic. Aethos stayed beside her the entire time, not directing her, not overriding her, working with her, answering her questions about the station's design, relaying her instructions to his crew, trusting her judgment in real time in a way that surprised even him. At the 14-minute mark, Davin did something unexpected with the pressure redirect sequence, a solution that no Vrethkai engineer had considered because it required thinking about the system as a whole rather than its individual parts. The cooling cycle stabilized, then smoothed, then ran cleaner than it had in months. Every alarm went silent. The room was very quiet for a moment. Then, slowly, the Vrethkai engineers turned and looked at the humans standing among them. Not with suspicion, not with anger, with something they had never expected to feel toward a prisoner. Respect. Afterward, in the corridor outside the reactor room, Aethos and Lyra stood together for a moment. Both of them were tired. The red emergency lights had faded back to normal. The station breathed steadily around them. You saved this station, Aethos said quietly. My team saved this station, Lyra corrected. Then, after a pause, you saved us the chance to do it. You opened the doors. Aethos looked at her. I had no other option. You had the option of letting it burn, she said simply. You didn't choose that. He was quiet for a long moment. Around them, crew members moved past, returning to their stations. No one was looking at the humans with fear anymore. I will not be sending you back to those cells, Aethos said finally. You will be given proper quarters, all of you. Lyra nodded once. Thank you. It is a practical decision, he said, his voice careful and even. Of course it is, she replied. Neither of them believed that entirely, and both of them knew it. That night, Lyra sat in her new quarters, small, plain, but clean and dignified, and looked out at the stars through a proper viewport for the first time since her capture. She thought about the way Aethos had stood beside her in that reactor room, not above her, not behind her, beside her, like a partner, like someone who had forgotten, just for a little while, that they were supposed to be on opposite sides. She thought about what he had said 5 days ago, standing at her cell door with his back to her. "No one has ever trusted me." She pressed her fingers lightly against the cold viewport glass. Something was changing. She could feel it the same way she had felt that reactor vibration through the floor, quiet and deep and impossible to ignore. She did not try to ignore it. The order arrived at dawn. Athos was sitting at his desk reviewing station reports when the encrypted message came through on his private command channel. He opened it without concern. Encrypted messages from the High Council were routine. Policy updates, resource allocations, tactical adjustments. He read the first line. Then he read it again. The message was short. The High Council had received intelligence that a human rescue fleet was mobilizing, large, fast, and moving in the direction of Void Keep. The Council's assessment was simple and cold. The human prisoners had become a liability. Their strange influence on station crew was noted. Their technical capabilities were considered a security risk. The order was clear. All human prisoners were to be terminated before the fleet arrived. Athos set the message down on his desk, very carefully, the way a person sets down something that might break if handled wrong. He sat completely still for a long moment. The station hummed quietly around him. Outside his viewport, the stars were the same stars they always were. Indifferent, ancient, unchanged. He picked up the message again and read it one more time. Then he did something he had never done in 22 years of military service. He destroyed it. He walked to Lyra's quarters with no plan prepared. No speech, no diplomatic framing. He had spent his entire career preparing before every significant action, calculating outcomes, measuring risks, building logical structures around every decision. This time, he simply walked. She opened the door before he knocked. She had heard his footsteps. She always heard his footsteps now, had learned their rhythm without meaning to. She looked at his face and knew immediately that something was wrong, not because he showed it openly. Athos almost never showed anything openly. But she had been studying him for weeks now, the same way she had studied the prison station on her first day, carefully, completely, until she understood the patterns. His jaw was set 1 degree tighter than usual. His eyes were very still. Something had happened. "Come in," she said quietly. He stepped inside and stood near the center of the room. He did not sit. He looked at her for a moment and then said, with no introduction and no softening, "The High Council has ordered your execution. All of you." Before the rescue fleet arrives, the room was completely silent. Lyra did not flinch. She absorbed the information the way she absorbed everything, steadily, completely, moving it immediately from shock into calculation. But her eyes stayed on his face. "You came to tell me," she said. "Yes." "Why?" He was quiet for just a moment. Then, "Because I destroyed the order, and I need you to contact your fleet before the Council sends it through a different channel." Lyra moved fast. She called Eli Marsh within 2 minutes. The young communications officer had spent weeks quietly, patiently, working on that cracked communication chip with wire and patience and the kind of stubborn human focus that simply does not accept impossible. He had told Lyra 3 days ago that it was functional, weak signal, short range, but functional. Tonight, short range was enough. Athos personally walked them to the station's outer communication relay and stood guard while Eli worked. His presence alone kept every crew member in that corridor moving past without question. No one challenged a high commander standing at a relay station at dawn. No one even slowed down. Eli's hands moved quickly. Lyra stood beside him, composing the message in her head. Coordinates, confirmation codes, prisoner count, status. Everything a rescue fleet needed in the fewest possible words. 15 minutes after Athos had walked into her quarters, the signal was sent. Eli looked up from the console with tired eyes and a quiet, relieved exhale. "They'll get it," he said. "They'll come." Lyra put her hand briefly on his shoulder. Then she turned to Athos. He was leaning against the corridor wall, arms crossed, looking at nothing in particular. The expression on his face was not fear. Not relief. It was the expression of someone who had just stepped permanently off a path they had walked their entire life and was now standing in open ground with no map. "You committed treason tonight," Lyra said, not as an accusation, just as a fact, spoken gently. "Yes," he said. "For us. For what was right," he said carefully. Then, after a pause that carried considerable weight, "and for you. Both things are true. I am not going to pretend otherwise." Lyra held his gaze. In 17 years of military service, she had been in firefights, crisis negotiations, and situations that most people would not survive. She had always known what she was feeling and why. Right now, standing in a dim corridor on an alien prison station with a rescue fleet incoming and a Vrethkai commander who had just risked everything for her people, she felt something so large and so quiet at the same time that she had no clean military word for it. She did not look away from him. "Neither will I," she said. The rescue fleet arrived 6 hours later. It was enormous. 17 human warships dropping out of faster-than-light travel in a tight formation that made Void Keep's defense systems scream with warnings. The station crew scrambled. Officers ran to battle stations. The entire structure vibrated with alarm and motion. In the middle of all of it, Lyra Voss walked to the primary communication bridge with Athos beside her and asked, not demanded, not forced, for a direct open channel to both the human fleet commander and the Vrethkai defense officers. She got it. What followed was 40 minutes of the most careful, precise, and determined negotiation Void Keep had ever witnessed. Lyra spoke to her own fleet commander with complete honesty. The prisoners were safe. No shots had been fired. There was a path forward that did not require a single weapon to be used. She spoke to the Vrethkai defense officers with equal directness. The human fleet was not an invasion force. It was a response, and responses could be de-escalated if both sides chose to think rather than react. Aethos spoke only once during the entire negotiation. He addressed the Vrethkai officers directly and told them, with the full weight of his rank and reputation, that he was vouching personally for the human commander's word. Coming from Aethos, that meant something. Even now, even after everything, the weapons stayed cold on both sides. The standoff ended not with victory for either fleet, but with something rarer and more valuable: an agreement to talk, a ceasefire, a beginning. When it was over, when the tension had finally drained out of the communication bridge and the crew around them had begun breathing normally again, Lyra stood at the viewport and looked at the human fleet holding position in the distance. Her fleet, her people, come all this way for her. She could board a ship right now and go home. She knew that. Everyone in the room knew that. She did not move toward the door. Davin Cole appeared beside her, quietly. He looked at her profile for a moment, then at Aethos standing a few feet away, and then back at Lyra. He was a perceptive man. He had been watching this story develop for weeks from the next cell over. "Commander," he said simply, "what are your orders?" Then she said, "Tell the fleet I am staying. Voluntarily. Tell them I am not in danger." She paused. "Tell them I am exactly where I need to be. No questions, no argument." He trusted her. He always had. He walked away to send the message. Lyra turned from the viewport and looked at Aethos. He was watching her with an expression she had never seen on his face before: open, uncertain, and completely unguarded for the first time since she had known him. "You stayed," he said quietly. "I stayed," she confirmed. Outside the viewport, the stars held steady between two fleets that had chosen, tonight, not to destroy each other. Inside, two people stood in the space between two worlds and chose something neither of them had planned for: each other. The galaxy did not know what to make of them. News traveled fast in interstellar space, faster than ships, faster than diplomats, faster than any official statement either government could prepare. Within weeks of the ceasefire at Void Keep, every major news channel across a dozen systems was carrying the same story in a dozen different languages. A human commander, a Vrethkai high officer, a prison station, a treason charge, a rescue fleet that fired no weapons. People called it many things. A scandal, a political crisis, a curiosity, a mistake. Nobody called it what it actually was. Not yet. Lyra spent the first month on Void Keep, navigating two worlds at the same time. During the day, she worked alongside a small team of human diplomats who had been permitted to board the station as part of the ceasefire agreement. They were building the framework for what would eventually become the first formal dialogue between humanity and the Vrathkai Empire. A slow, careful, complicated process that required patience she had and stubbornness she had more of. She sat in long meetings where Vrathkai Council representatives spoke in careful, measured tones and watched her with pale eyes that were still deciding what she was. She answered every question directly. She did not perform warmth. She did not feel, and she did not hide the firmness that she did. She was exactly herself in every room she entered. Slowly, carefully, the Vrathkai representatives began to respond to that. Not with warmth, that was not their way, but with something the Vrathkai valued above almost everything else: consistency, honesty, reliability. Lyra Voss said what she meant. She did what she said. She did not change her position based on who was in the room. For a species that had spent centuries navigating political deception from every direction, a person like that was rare enough to be genuinely remarkable. Aethos, meanwhile, was fighting a different battle entirely. His treason trial began 40 days after the ceasefire. It was a formal Vrathkai military proceeding, cold, structured, precise. The charges were serious: destroying a direct High Council order, aiding enemy prisoners, compromising station security, enabling unauthorized communication with a hostile fleet. Every charge was accurate. Aethos did not deny a single one. What he did instead was present his case with the same calm, methodical precision that had made him one of the most respected officers in the Vrathkai military for over 2 decades. He did not appeal to emotion. He did not ask for sympathy. He laid out fact by fact and number by number exactly what would have happened if he had followed the Council's order. The human fleet would have arrived to find their people dead. There would have been no negotiation, no ceasefire, no dialogue. There would have been war, immediate, total, and catastrophic for both sides. The Vrathkai military projections, which Aethos presented from their own classified files, showed a conflict that neither civilization would emerge from cleanly. He had not committed treason, he argued. He had prevented a disaster that the High Council's fear had almost created. The council chamber was very quiet when he finished. Lyra testified on the 3rd day. She walked into a Vrathkai military court, the first human being who had ever done so, and she stood at the center of that cold, formal room and spoke for 40 minutes without notes. She did not speak about her feelings. She did not speak about what Aethos meant to her personally. She understood instinctively that this room did not want a love story. This room wanted evidence and logic and concrete truth. So she gave them that. She presented casualty projections. She presented diplomatic value assessments. She presented a detailed account of every moment aboard Void Keep, where Aethos had made decisions that served both species rather than just one. She described the reactor crisis. She described the ceasefire negotiation. She described a commanding officer who had spent the entire duration of their captivity treating human prisoners with more basic dignity than the High Council's final order had. She finished by looking directly at the senior council member and saying, "You are deciding today whether to punish the one officer in your military who prevented a war. I will leave that decision to your judgment, but I want you to understand exactly what you would be punishing him for." She walked out of that room and did not look back. The charges were dismissed 4 days later. Not unanimously, not warmly, but dismissed. Aethos received the verdict in his quarters alone. He sat with it for a long time. Then he did something that surprised a few people who knew him well enough to notice. He smiled, very quietly, to himself. Just once, after the verdict, Aethos submitted his formal resignation from the Vrathkai military. It was not a dramatic act. He did not make a speech. He did not hold a ceremony. He simply submitted the paperwork through the correct channels, cleared his office of personal items, which were few, because he had always lived simply, and walked out of the military section of Void Keep for the last time. He walked directly to the diplomatic wing. Lyra was at her desk when he appeared in the doorway. She looked up. He was wearing civilian clothes for the first time she had ever seen. Plain, dark, simple. Without the uniform, he looked different. Not smaller, just more like himself. "You resigned," she said. "Yes. How does it feel?" He considered the question seriously, the way he considered everything. "Lighter," he said finally. "It feels lighter." Lyra stood up from her desk. The Joint Diplomatic Initiative needs a Vrethkai representative who understands both sides. Someone who knows the station, knows the council, and knows how to navigate difficult rooms without losing their footing. "That is a very professional way to offer someone a position," Aethos said. "I am a very professional person," Lyra replied. "You are," he agreed. Then, quietly, "Is that the only reason you want me here?" She looked at him steadily across the small office. Outside the viewport behind her, both a human diplomatic vessel and a Vrethkai station ship were holding position in the same stretch of space without weapons raised, something that would have been impossible to imagine 1 year ago. "No," she said simply. "It is not the only reason." The ceremony was small. Neither of them wanted large. Neither of them wanted political. There had already been enough politics surrounding their story to last several lifetimes. What they wanted was honest and quiet and real. Davin Cole stood on Lyra's side, steady and calm as always, holding a small human tradition flower she had asked him to bring from the nearest human outpost, which he had done without a single question because that was who Davin Cole was. Two of Aethos's oldest colleagues stood on his side, officers who had watched him for 20 years and said privately to each other, before the ceremony, that they had never seen him look the way he looked today. Present, completely present. The officiant spoke in both languages. The vows were short. Neither Lyra nor Aethos was a person who needed many words to say something true. When it was done, when the room around them exhaled with quiet celebration, Lyra looked up at Aethos and thought about everything that had brought them to this moment. A prison cell, a reactor fire, a destroyed order, a trial, a resignation, 1,000 small choices made in the space between fear and courage. "Still think we were a mistake?" she asked him softly. Aethos looked at her, the way he had looked at her since that very first moment in her cell, when she had stood up straight and refused to be small, and said, "I think we were the most logical outcome of everything that happened." Lyra laughed, quietly, genuinely. "That is the most romantic thing you have ever said." "I am working on it," he said. And for the first time in as long as anyone who knew him could remember, Aethos laughed too. The galaxy eventually found a name for what they were. Not a scandal. Not a political crisis. Not a curiosity or a mistake. History called them the beginning, the first thread in a relationship between two civilizations that would take generations to fully weave together. Diplomats would study their ceasefire negotiation for decades. Scholars would write about the Void Keep trial. Political scientists would trace the entire first era of human Vrethkai cooperation back to one prison station and two people who refused to see each other as enemies. But Lyra and Aethos never called themselves a beginning. They called themselves exactly what they were, a love story, theirs, built in the hardest possible place, from the most unlikely possible materials, by two people who had no plan and no map, and only one thing that turned out to be enough: the choice to keep showing up for each other every single day. The end.